Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roots. I'm happy to speak with you today because due to circumstances, this podcast has been quiet for a few weeks. But we are back. I would like to spend this episode of the Pioneer Podcast to talk about the Pioneer Initiative, what it is, what it means, what we are already doing, and what we intend to do. This initiative was announced in March 2025. It's still a preliminary structure because we have decided to launch it in such a way that people will have the opportunity to sign up, become involved, and contribute to the discussion about how the institution ought to be shaped and structured. Even the name, Pioneer Initiative, is a placeholder name for now, which will be looked into in the weeks to follow as we work toward a more final structure for the initiative. Now, I have been invited to return as a speaker at one of the world's biggest international conservative conferences, CPAC Hungary. This conference will happen in the end of May 2025. I mention this because considering this, we have decided that it's wise to work intensely on the structure in the weeks to follow in order to have it finalized before the conference. Since the launch, we have been inundated with support. Support has rolled in at a much higher pace than we expected, for which we are very grateful. In fact, from a resource perspective, we have reached the point after 1 month that we hoped to achieve after 1 year. This doesn't mean that the institution is completely financially self-sufficient yet. There is still a way to go to achieve this. It does, however, mean that we are on the way to financial sustainability. When we announced the Pioneer Initiative, I remarked that the fact that the ship is headed in the wrong direction has become less important than the fact that the ship is sinking. Now let me take a moment to explain what this means. When we say that the ship is headed in the wrong direction, we mean that South Africa is in a bad or perhaps even destructive policy environment. If a government does only one thing, it should be to protect life, liberty, and property. However, in South Africa, we find that these three things are increasingly under threat. And so what a country needs is a policy environment in which life, liberty, and property are protected, and increasingly so. But what we experience in South Africa is that these three things are increasingly targeted and deteriorating. This is why we say that the ship is headed in the wrong direction. But to say that the ship is headed in the wrong direction is different than to say that the ship is sinking. Why is the ship sinking in South Africa? It is sinking because the state is failing. The debate at the moment is not whether South Africa is failing or succeeding, but rather how to describe the failure. Whether South Africa is a failed state or a failing state, which means that at best it is a failing state. And it does seem that the deterioration of South African society, especially as far as government functions are concerned, is accelerating. And so, the fact of the matter is that South Africa is changing. The fact is not that South Africa is going to change, it is that South Africa is already changing, and that it will continue to change. Furthermore, it is reasonable to conclude that the pace at which South Africa is changing is going to accelerate in the months and years ahead. The good news is that we don't need to be idle spectators. We have a role to play in ensuring that when things change, as is sure to happen, they change for the better. South Africa is headed not just towards political change, but towards a constitutional realignment. There are already radical groups calling for the constitution to be scrapped or abolished, calling for a more radical constitutional dispensation, one that will facilitate more aggressive socialist policies, more race laws, and so forth. But things can also change for the better. we can have a more decentralized system. We can have one that is based on the principle of self-governance, in which people govern themselves as opposed to this warped idea of democracy as two wolves and a lamb voting on what is for dinner. A sense of democracy that draws no distinction between what our Western tradition has taught us on what democracy is supposed to be and the notion of the tyranny of the majority that the American founding father John Adams has so eloquently cautioned against. I should add that constitutional change is not a strange thing. When I say constitutional change, I don't primarily refer to the written text of the South African Constitution. I refer to the classical conception of the Constitution and of constitutional change, which is simply to say the way things are. In other words, the way things are is changing and is going to continue to change. It could change for the worse, but we can play a role to ensure that it changes for the better. In as far as we are referring to the actual document when we say constitutional change, I should add that even this is not such a strange idea. A study by the University of Chicago Law School has found that the average constitution lasts for about 17 years until it is changed and replaced by something new. There are a lot of things to be concerned about. When we read the news, we only see bad news. But there is also good news. The good news, in fact, the best news I have discovered during this past month is just how much support there is for these ideas, both within South Africa and abroad. That is, the idea that the political system has to be decentralized and that people should govern themselves. But before I continue, let me say this. I am an Afrikaner. I am proud of my Afrikaner history, culture, and heritage. There is nothing that I want more than for the Afrikaner people to be free, because regardless of whether you agree or not, we are not free. If you think that we are free, it can only be because your conception of what it means to be free has become eroded to such an extent that you have forgotten the taste of freedom. Forgotten, or perhaps that you have never experienced it. The thing is that we do not really know the taste of freedom because we have never truly experienced it. But we know that it is worth pursuing, that it is a noble cause, and that this pursuit is not altogether unrealistic. This is not to say that freedom is some utopia, that we can create a world in which we lie by the river reading poetry all day. This is because there are no silver bullets and there are no final solutions. We can never experience total freedom in the utopian sense of the word because we are only human beings and human beings are fallible. But we can move towards more freedom or less freedom. But the good news is that it is not only the Afrikaners who want more freedom. Most people and most communities want it. I say most because there will always be those who oppose what we are working toward regardless of how noble the pursuit is. Furthermore, as an Afrikaner, I need to stress that a solution for the Afrikaner people cannot be one at the expense of the rest. This is why we need to find tangible solutions based on the idea of self-governance, not just for one group, but for all groups. There will be those who oppose this, even though decentralization and self-governance is obviously a good idea. This is because there are those who are so consumed by hatred, envy, and contempt that they know and want no other course than the course of destruction. The only thing that they are interested in is power and the pursuit of their distorted conception of social justice, which in the end has nothing to do with justice as we know it. And so, there is a lot of work to do. We need to do a lot of thinking, but thinking alone is not enough. we need to do a lot of talking, but talking alone is not enough. We need to take action, but taking action alone is not enough. When people say that we need to stop thinking and start speaking, or that we need to stop speaking and start doing, they are presenting a false dilemma. The truth of the matter is that we need to do all three at the same time and as a collective. Furthermore, these three elements do not constitute a linear process, but a continuous cycle. When we think, we expand and sharpen our ideas. When we speak, we refine and convey these ideas. And when we take action, we channel these ideas and the support that we have garnered into tangible results. And the good news is that when we approach these things as a collective, they reinforce and strengthen each other, creating a well-oiled machine. This is what we need to do. But also, we cannot do this alone. When I say that we cannot do this alone, I mean that I cannot do this alone because one person can only do so much. I mean that we, the team, cannot do this alone because we need support. I mean that we as a collective cannot do this alone because we need to reach out to other communities and build bridges. I mean that we living in South Africa cannot do this alone because we are also part of an international community and we need to strengthen ties with our friends abroad. We need to build bridges, but sometimes building bridges is not sufficient. Sometimes we need to draw a line, and sometimes we need to dig a trench. We need to be unapologetic for the things that we seek to preserve. We cannot reach out and build bridges when the process of building the bridge requires of us to abandon who we are or to participate in dishonest and fraudulent narratives. We need to reach out and strengthen ties, but we also need to remain true to who we are. And remaining true to who we are must first and foremost be built on the foundation of truth. Because if we are not committed to the preservation and the pursuit of truth, we cannot remain true to who we are. Of course, we will make mistakes. There will be times when bad ideas seem like good ideas. There will be times when we misspeak or say something that we believe to be true only to discover that it wasn't. There will be times when we take action only to learn in hindsight that it would have been better if we took a different approach. And so, when we make mistakes, we correct them. But we will not apologize because, as my friend Ernst van Zyl has remarked, one does not apologize to someone who is not interested in mercy or forgiveness, and who will only interpret that apology as an admission of guilt and a justification for destructive behavior. We will remember the words of Theodore Roosevelt that it's not the critic who counts, that it's easy to criticize the players on the field if you do not have skin in the game, but that in the end, it is the players on the field who eventually win the game. And we are in it for the win. If we are truly in this to create a better future for our descendants, to change things for the better, then we need to get ready. We need to sharpen the saw every day. We need to develop ourselves and strengthen our ideas, our plans, and our frame of reference. We need to speak in convincing terms and rally those who are open for our ideas to our side instead of alienating them. We need to take calculated risks and take action to reach tangible results. This is not something to be fearful of, it is something that should excite us. We have the opportunity to make history, to preserve the things that we have inherited, and to change things for the better. And there is nothing that excites me more than this. And in the process, I sincerely hope that you will join us. If you support this initiative and if you want to play a more active role in the pursuit of these things that we wish to inherit and these things that we believe needs to be changed, I would like to encourage you to become more involved and play a more active supporting role by clicking in the link in the description.